Hi, everybody. My name is Ashish. The other co-authors on this paper is Adam, an undergrad researcher in our lab, my PI, Pedram Hassanzadeh, and our collaborator, Krishna, from the Department of Computer Science. In this paper, we are presenting a novel deep learning-based super-parametrization method, which is going to be used to do effective surrogate modeling at low computational costs while preserving the accuracy that you would get for high-resolution models. So this is done primarily for complex partial differential equations that exhibit different variants of spatiotemporal scales. It presents multi-scale physics. It is usually high-dimensional because of a high resolution of discretization, and it is very chaotic in general. And one such example of a complex partial differential equation is the climate system, which exhibits several scales of processes interacting with each other without a definite scale separation. And yet, for all practical purposes, a numerical model cannot actually handle all these scales together. So what they do is essentially they simulate the larger scales at high resolution while they try to approximate the smaller scales with one method or the other. Throughout the length of this talk, I'll talk about three distinct scales: X, which is the large scale processes; Y, which would be intermediate scales, and really approximating these scales is the challenge in most numerical models. While we would have another poorly understood, hard to observe variables or processes which would be ignored in all simulations. And so our motivation basically is a very complex climate system which exhibits as a set of partial differential equations that are hard to solve and hard to resolve at all scales. So what do people really do in these cases? Well, all common climate models and practically used ones do something called physics-based parametrization, where they resolve the large scale at a low temporal resolution, while the small scales are approximated as an analytical function of the large scale. And this is very approximate, very inaccurate, but it gives us cost-scalable, low-resolution models, and is used primarily in practice. But they're very inaccurate at the same time. The other option is to do super-parametrization, where for every grid point in the large scale, we resolve the y at a high temporal resolution, but then only feed into the large scale at low temporal resolution. So for example, if y is integrated at every second, then it feeds into the large scale at every hour. This way we save some cost, but still this remains very intractable for all practical applications, and is only used when we try to find very subtle features in the atmosphere or in that partial differential equations that is not commonly available by using a low resolution model. In this paper, we are trying to build an accurate data-driven super-parametrization technique. So basically do simulations which are as accurate as super-parameterized simulations, but at the same cost as that of low-resolution models. And secondly, and more interestingly, we're trying to see whether this method, this deep learning-based method, can generalize to new data distributions, which is commonly not possible in most machine learning algorithms. If the training regime is changed, if the testing sets come from a new data distribution, then the model cannot generalize. And here we present a model that can. So this can actually be used for to make climate change projections, that is, try to understand the dynamics of the atmosphere under a climate change regime where the data distribution changes. So we start with the toy weather model, which is the multi-scale Lorenz 96 system. Here x, y, z are the same scales that I talked about. They're coupled with each other, and there are two parameters here which determine the amplitude and the temporal variability of these scales. And capital F denotes how much chaotic the system is. Larger the f, the more chaotic it becomes. So if you look at these two plots, this is with one set of h and c, and the second one is with another set of h and c. The one on the top left is basically where y is in equilibrium with x. That is, the temporal variation of y is much larger than that of x. We call this system to be in quasi-equilibrium, and this whole parametrization technique only holds true if such a case arises. But in real turbulence simulations, real atmosphere, this scale separation is not there, which is the second case. And in this case, these low-resolution models that parameterizes y as a function of x does not quite work. We believe that this is where our model comes in to do real simulations of the atmosphere. So here we present a number of different methods over which we are going to benchmark our method. The true data is obtained by doing the most expensive simulation possible, that is integrating x, y, and z at the lowest possible resolution, which is delta t. Something that is a little more tractable is high-resolution simulation, yet for all practical purposes is impossible. It's ignoring the hard-to-understand variables and just integrating x and y. low resolution basically looks like this. Here, y is approximated as a function of x, and then x is integrated at 10 delta t instead of delta t. So it's low resolution, less accurate, but tractable, and often is very inaccurate. Super-parametrization is where y is integrated at delta t, but only fed at every 10 delta t. So really, this is better than that of LR, but it's still very expensive in real simulations, but it's slightly more accurate than LR. What has been commonly done in this line of work is where people try to replace the capital F in low resolution models with a neural network that is trained on very high resolution data. That way it is better than a crude approximation because it is trained on very high resolution data, but it's still not as good as super-parameterized simulations. And this is the method that we are proposing, where we have some sort of an RNN that, in this case it would be a GRU, which integrates y at every delta t and feeds into the large scale at every 10 delta t. Except that the large scale always keeps on correcting y at every intervals of 10 delta t. So this is a corrector mechanism that makes the GRU more accurate than what it would have been if the whole thing was just integrated with a data-driven deep learning method. So we see how this basically works. You have y1 and x1. A GRU integrates it at every delta t, and this continues till 10 delta t. And then it feeds into a fourth order Ranga-Katta solver. This is a numerical solver, which is very accurate but very expensive. But this only integrates it at every 10 delta t. And then the new x that is obtained is fed back into the GRU, and the x that was integrated with the GRU is corrected. So this way, there is a correcting mechanism after every 10 delta t, which makes the GRU more accurate than it would have been if it was simply updating in time without any correcting mechanism. So let's look at some of the results. HR, SP, DDSP, you know the acronyms here. There's one more acronym that is DD, which is the purely data-driven model, which is expected not to do really well. And this is the first case where the system is in equilibrium. So the LR and data-driven parameterization is supposed to work pretty well. And you see here the DDSP is doing better than DDP, but not as good, not good enough to call it a very efficient method. But in the next case, when we have the red circles, which is coming from a system that is not in equilibrium, you see that DDSP outperforms DDP and LR by a big margin. And in all cases, the purely data-driven model, which is just a GRU integrating all the scales, is not doing as well. The numbers there, the numbers with the boxes are basically the computational costs. So you see I'm doing almost as good as SP, which is the more tractable but very computationally expensive climate simulation. I'm doing as well as SP at the cost of LR or DDP. These are some of the trajectories that it would present. The truth is the DNS. This is HR, which is pretty good. Then SP, which is also very good, but all of these are very expensive. As soon as you try to reduce the computational cost, you become very inaccurate with LR or with DDP. Now, here's our method, DDSP, which is doing almost as good as SP or HR for a particular initial condition. Of course, we report the errors over 100 different initial conditions because it is a very chaotic system, so every initial condition is different. Now, the more interesting question is that would this method generalize to a new data distribution? So when the testing set comes from a probability distribution that is different from that of the training set, can this method really generalize? And we hope it can because it has a corrector mechanism in it. It's not purely a deep learning method, but it is augmented by a numerical solver. So this is the first set of results that I showed you. It was trained with capital F with 20, and if I change this F, the distribution would change. So this is the first set of results. What would happen if I train this model on this data, freeze it, and then test it in a new regime where capital F is equal to 24? Well, the errors increase, obviously, because now I have a more chaotic system. It's hard to predict. And you see that the data-driven model, the purely data-driven model, has a huge error, which basically says it does not generalize at all. To make a comparison, to say that it generalizes or does not, we have to compare this with a system that is trained and tested both with F equal to 24. And these are the diamonds. You can see that for DDSP, the triangle and the diamond really overlaps, which means a model that was frozen and trained for F equal to 20 can predict as well as a model that was trained on F equal to 24. Basically, it is generalized for new data distributions, which enables us finally to do long-term PDE integrations where the anthropogenic forcings, the external forcings have changed so that the dynamics of the regime have changed, and yet the deep learning model can generalize to these new data sets. So in conclusion, we have a very inexpensive super-parametrization method. It is as accurate as any expensive super-parametrization method, and it's purely data-driven, so it's done at the same cost as that of a low-resolution model. Now, the more interesting thing that we have seen here, that such a deep learning model, instead of just a standalone deep learning model, can generalize to new data distributions, which makes it very convenient to do very long-term climate simulations, or simulations where the external forcings have changed and the dynamics of the regime has changed. So essentially, the data distribution has changed. So that's it.